KAARO, everyone. Now, so good morning and welcome to the Leadership Workshop like no other. Leadership Assembly, in partnership with Luminary Learning Solutions, are proud to present a workshop on leadership training. So this is a carefully curated workshop which will hopefully offer you perspectives, knowledge nuggets, and insights to leverage your next step for success. I am your facilitator this afternoon. I'm Anton Thayalan, the Chief Evangelist for Luminary Learning Solutions. But before we commence, here are a few ground rules to help us along this workshop. Please be on mute and keep your video on where possible, as it will be nice for us to see some other faces, as we only get to see our own most of the time. This will be a 30 to 40 minute presentation followed by a Q&A session where you can discuss, share, ask, and connect with the guest and the participants. Please do send in your questions at any time during the conversation, during the discussion, starting now. You can choose to ask your question via the chat option on Zoom, or if you want to do this via WhatsApp, the number on the screen, or use the raise the hand icon on Zoom, and I will give you an opportunity and invite you to ask your question. So just for those who've joined in from other parts of the world, and for those in Nigeria, Leadership Assembly is an NGO founded in 2017 by Jude Anumudu, with a focus on youth and leadership development for all young people and emerging leaders, and skills training with foreign partners that will help them to be the best at what they do and to fulfill their purpose in life. On that note, it is my pleasure to introduce Jude Anumudu to say a few words and just a little bit of a background on Jude. For those of you who do not know him, and I think that's very few in Nigeria, he is the founder and CEO of Leadership Assembly. He is the co-founder of Global Leadership Forum and host of the Young Leaders Conference. Hailing from Nigeria, he is an accountant, an author, a writer, a business consultant, an international leadership consultant, and speaker. Jude has been featured and interviewed in many global platforms, and he is a keynote speaker on leadership conferences, summits, webinars, training, and coaching. On that note, Jude, to say a few words this morning, please. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Anton. I really appreciate the introduction. You have actually said everything about me. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. This is Jude Anumudu from Nigeria. Like as he said, everything he said is true about me. I don't think I have anything much to say. The only thing I want to say is that Leadership Assembly is committed to helping young people in Nigeria and in the African continent and all over the world to build a true leader and become, there's a difference between true leader and leadership, okay? We can say we are leaders, why we don't know the important and what it means to be a true leader. So we are committed to build leaders of value. We are committed to be servant leaders and transformative leaders. This is simply what Leadership Assembly do. Also, on the other side, we also do charity work, whereby we try to reach out to some communities that is yet to be unreached, to see how we can help them to realize and fulfill their purpose in life. So I think it's my pleasure to be in the forefront of this meeting. And I hope that your coming here today will not be like you just come, you just learn and just go. So I believe that before you leave on this session, that you are going to leave an impression in your life that will make a change, that tomorrow when you remember this training, you will see that yes, my life was changed because I attended Luminary Learning Leadership Training in conjunction with Leadership Assembly. So I hope that you're coming here today, you'll be impacted and your mindset about leadership will be changed. So thank you everybody present. Thank you, Anton. Thank you, Vidisha. Thank you for making this possible. I really appreciate your presence. So thank you so much. Over to you, Anton.
Thank you, Jude. And now to introduce our guest. Today, the session would be facilitated by Vidushanatha Vitharana. He is the founder and destiny architect for Luminary Learning Solutions and High Five Consultancy. A bit about Vidusha. He is a seasoned trainer, a consultant, and a coach with over 15 years of hands-on experience, having led HR and HRD initiatives that have won accolades globally. Vidusha has the ability to simplify the complex without diluting it. He has run assignments in 12 countries around the world. On that note, it is my pleasure to welcome Vidusha and hand over the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Anton. I'm just gonna share my screen, make sure that everyone can see it, and then we'll get cracking. Everyone can see my screen? All right, good morning to everyone who are joining us from. You can see the screen? All right, so good morning for anyone who's joining us from that side of the world. Good afternoon for anyone who's joining in from our part of the world. It's grand to be here, and thank you for having us.
In Nigeria, we have very few.
Was that a comment or?
I think someone? Anton, yeah, I think somebody just joined in. Maybe I think the mic was on. So Anton, is your work to monitor everybody so that there will not be a whole bar from the people's background, okay?
Of course. So thank you for having us. And I always make this apology before I start because I'm generally very, very sincere in what I say. So my apologies if I'm brutally honest on certain things. Anton generally, I'm glad his face can still be seen because then I can see his facial reactions when I say this. He generally does this when I start speaking about leadership training. Most of the time because he's the man in charge of business development for Luminary. And whenever I speak, people have a question mark on that. So let me start here. Let me start by asking the question, why is it that there is so much of conversations and discussions and dialogue about leadership training? Let me give you some statistics. Now, if you take a look at it globally, leadership training is a $14 billion business. And that's the amount just US companies spend annually on leadership development. Okay. Now, if you take a look at that number, that's staggering to the point where I think, some of our smaller countries probably has this as our GDP. Now, if you take a look at the vocation itself, it is tremendously out there. And every single day that you switch on LinkedIn or Facebook or anything at all, you will find something on leadership. And if you actually Google the word leadership, probably out of all management topics that you can find, this probably has the highest level of content on the internet on any management subject. Why is that? Because, well, everybody seems to think that leadership training is important. And who am I to argue? Given the fact that I'm a leadership trainer as well. And I use this word carefully, and I'll explain why. Now, the interesting part about this is that if you take a look at the top tier organizations around the world, they generally spend about $150,000 per person. Let me repeat that, $150,000 per person for top tier leadership development. And if that be the case, you've got to understand the fact that clearly people think this is absolutely imperative for organizations to do. Now, take a look at the rest of the statistics though. If you ask senior managers, only 1 out of 4 senior managers admitted that leadership training is a critical tool to influencing business outcomes. Only 1 in 4. You spend $150,000 per person on leadership development training. But after a survey poll of the top 500 organizations around the globe, only 1 in 4 turned around and said that leadership training is a critical tool for influencing business outcomes. Now you understand my plight in this, isn't it? When we walk into an organization and say leadership training is important and do the whole sales pitch and propound the fact that we have to do this, if somebody throws this out at you, what is your response going to be? Well, the big ask is that why do leadership training in the first place? If only 1 out of 4 people, only 25% of your senior management positions actually think it is important, why do it in the first place? Especially when you spend $14 billion in doing just that. So we actually have been looking at this very same question for the last 15 years. And what we're going to share with you is some of our findings and also a few tips that would enable you to do this just right. So let me get down to the crux of it. Now, the fundamental assumption is that one can train to be a leader. And this is where the biggest flaw is. You really can't train anybody, I think, on leadership, and certainly not on any of the soft skills either. Take a look at the plethora of soft skills that are there out there in the market, right? Communication skills, emotional intelligence, how to be a coach, how do we make sure that we motivate people, how do we engage a working population, how do we make sure that we are able to truly bring out the best in people. Now, if these can be trained in the traditional sense of the word, then I think for all the training programs organizations have done, we must be doing brilliantly well. And the reality of it is, well, nothing much changes after training. Think about it. How many training programs have all of you gone for? And what happens? Well, nothing really much, if you really want to be honest about it. And we make no bones about this. We are absolutely brutally honest. So if you really look at it from a leadership perspective, from a soft skills perspective, you really can't train someone for it. I have a daughter and a son. My daughter, I think, somehow inherited my wife's genetic makeup. So thankfully, she's a beautiful kid with beautiful ways. My son, on the other hand, unfortunately, inherited my genetic makeup. And therefore, he is probably one of the most difficult people to contend with, even though the small fellow is only 12 years old. Now, I'm having difficulty, and my wife is having difficulty in actually being able to teach my son how to do the simplest of things on a regular enough basis. And if we are finding it so difficult to teach a 12-year-old to simply sit in one place and study for 1 hour a day, as a father with complete jurisdiction over him, you imagine how difficult it is to get an employee population to be trained on leadership. So the issue is this. The issue is the word train. The assumption is that if I am standing here and I'm saying something, that all of you will get it and you will be able to go back and do something with it. That's not true. It really isn't true. And countless research has been done to prove this, that adults cannot be trained. However, you can learn things. Now, that is a completely different paradigm. Training is one thing. Learning is another. Can you learn leadership? Absolutely. Can you learn to communicate better? Absolutely. Can you learn to be a better coach? Absolutely. Can you learn to interact with people better with emotional intelligence? Absolutely. But can you train them? Absolutely not. So understand the distinction, first of all, because it is absolutely essential that you differentiate the two words. You cannot train anyone on leadership or any soft skills, but you can get people to learn it. Then obviously, you're going to ask me the question, okay, understand the difference from a cognitive perspective. I understand the difference. All right, training is different to learning. Fair enough. What am I supposed to do now? What are the building blocks of it? Let me take you through them. So first of all, you need to be able to have an individual who wants to learn. There's an age-old saying, isn't it? that you can take a horse to water, but you really can't make it drink it. And it's true. So the whole purpose of learning only starts when you want to learn. Again, my son today got into a lot of trouble with the mother simply because he hadn't done his homework. Sunday is supposed to be a free day for him. And this is where he goes and plays and does whatever he wants to. But the condition is that he should have finished all of his homework for the week. So my wife ruffles through the books and looks at his work, and it's half done, flows into an absolute nightmarish rage and turns around and says, "You haven't done your work. Make sure you do it. You will not play today until you have done your work." And this happens quite frequently actually with him. Now, there's nothing wrong with him, apart from one thing. He doesn't see the point of doing all of this. He gets decent grades. He gets, 60s, 70s, and 80s in class without really doing anything much. He listens in class, that's about it. He comes back home and plays, but goes for his exams and simply manages to get the marks that he wants and comes back. So his mother often asks him, "Don't you want to get 90? And his general lackadaisical answer is, "Well, why do I have to get 90s? If I get 90s, well, I pass. If I get 60s, I pass." And my wife looks at me and says, "This is all your fault." And it's true. It is my fault because I had the same attitude when I was in school. How can I blame him? But the point is, he doesn't want to. Now, no amount of thrashing him will ever do it, because until he wants to really learn, well, he will just go about it and probably do it simply because his mother is asking him to. And that's no way to teach a child or an adult for that matter. So an individual must want to be a leader. Now ask yourself the question, why would someone want to be a leader? Wanting to be a manager, that's understandable. Once I become a manager, I get a better salary, I get a car, I get fringe benefits. All of that is available for me. I get a title. Why a leader? Seems a lot more work for absolutely nothing else. And therein lies the differentiation. If you really want someone to improve something, leadership, emotional intelligence, communication, any soft skill for that matter, that person must be able to be confronted with the fact that it is in his best interest or her best interest to actually be able to learn and improve themselves. So that's the first building block. The second building block is that the individual must want to learn how to be a leader. Now, leadership doesn't just happen. Just because I want to be a leader doesn't mean I all of a sudden can download from the internet wisdom that I can actually now dispense at my will and be able to make changes in my life. It doesn't work that way. You must be willing to learn, and learning is a lifelong process. And unless you commit to it, very few people truly realize their full potential. So on the one hand, you must want to be a leader, or you must want to improve something. On the other hand, you must be willing to learn it. Now, if those two conditions are met, then an organization must have a culture that actually supports it. Now, this is very, very important. Most of the time, when we do any form of learning intervention, any form of training, unless people can go and actually practice it at work, in their own settings, they really never want to do it again. If the organization does not embrace this learning, give people the space to experiment with it, well then, whatever you have learned will never be put into practice. It's a bit like learning to swim, isn't it? Think about it. If you really wanted to swim, first of all, you must want to swim in the first place. If you think swimming is not for you, you will never get inside a pool. Then you must be willing to learn how to swim. And of course, you must have some opportunity somewhere to actually get in and swim. If you can't do that for yourself, how will you improve in it? So if, again, from a child's perspective, if the child wants to learn how to swim, we send him for swimming practices, but then wherever we go, we see a pool and we turn around and say, you know what, don't swim. It can be dangerous. Don't swim at all. Well, then the child will never learn. Even if they learn the basics, they will never improve. So you must have an opportunity to experiment with it and to actually put it into practice. And then inside the organization, what is learned must be put into practice. And the final point is that you must be able to actually bring about some form of result as a benefit after training. Now, I often ask the question, why learn anything that you wouldn't use? Why learn anything that you cannot use and make a success out of it? And that is honestly a question that we need to ask as professionals. If we are going to commit to training, if we are going to have learning interventions, if we are going to put resources behind it, $14 billion out of it, you better be making sure that there is some tangible benefit out of it. And if you cannot show that tangibly, visibly, quantifiably, well then this entire vocation of training has a very limited shelf life. Notice the fact that we have a multitude of programs, and this one key question keeps coming up every single time we go to meet clients. The honest question always is, so what happens after the training? And if you do not have an answer to that, well, chances are it's going to be very short-lived. So all of this means that you must have inside the organization a learning process inbuilt. And if you're doing a leadership training program, if you're doing a soft skills training program, then the training program must have all of these included in the design of the program itself. You must have a way of making sure that people want to be there, not that they're just brought in there. Most organizations would simply make a list of people and say, you know what, you're going for a training program. What is it on? Leadership. What is it on? Communication. What is it on? Emotional intelligence. Go, learn something and come back. Not good enough. What are you doing in order to make sure that they understand that they must improve on this aspect? What are you doing to understand whether they are willing to learn and put themselves through the motions in order to learn something out of it? When they come back, you must have something inbuilt inside the organization that gets the entire organization involved in putting what they have learned into practice. And from all of that, you must be able to get some result out of it and be able to demonstrate it. If you do that, if that process is there, then chances are the question of why training never comes up. Training does not become a cost at that point. Training does become an investment. So if that process is clear, ask yourself, how do we learn? Not how to train, forget how to train. Most of the time, we look at this very, very carefully. We look at how to make a training interesting. We spend humongous amount of time perfecting our craft in delivering a program, which is great. You can't fall asleep, for sure. However, what is more important is to understand how people really learn. And think about it. How have we learned anything? Notice the fact that any child learns a language without ever being taught it. Think about it carefully. When we enter school, when we enter Montessori, in fact, or preschool, we already speak. How did we learn how to speak? And also understand the fact that you can take a child from anywhere around the globe, put them in a completely different country, and the child will pick up that language without a problem. Take a child from Sri Lanka and place him in Japan. He or she will speak Japanese. Take a child from the UK and place him in Sri Lanka. They will speak Sinhalese or Tamil without any issue whatsoever, never being taught. If they're around people who speaks that language, they will pick it up. How? By mimicking, by watching others, by simply mimicking the words. And that's how we learn a lot of things. Take a typical organizational setting. look at your former bosses and ask yourself, don't you work that way? So if a boss behaves in a certain way, everyone who's junior looks up to the boss and says, maybe this is how I should be when I become a manager. And one day you do become a manager, and chances are you do some of the things that you saw in your previous bosses, which is how we learn. We also learn through practical experiences. So one, we learn through mimicking, by observation, but we also learn from our own practical experiences, by doing things, not by necessarily reading something, but by experiencing something. Take the most simplest of examples. You walk on the road, simple thing. You just walk on the road in different parts of the world. And within a day, you will realize that how you should walk in the streets, on the streets in Nigeria, how you should walk on the streets in Sri Lanka, how you should walk on the streets of Dubai, and how you should walk on the streets of the UK or the US can be completely different. And if it's in the US, different states will have different ways of doing this. You cannot just walk. Even walking is an experience. Now, if you internalize this, then chances are instinctively you will know, hey, you know what? In these kind of conditions, this is how I should be. That's by practical experience. Not by formal education, not by a training program, but simply practical experience. Also, we learn by the stories we hear. In fact, all of our cultures are passed down from generation to the next generation purely based on the stories we tell. Religion is taught based on the stories we tell. Values are taught by the stories we tell. And of course, there are people who would learn, and we all learn through formal education, reading, theories and concepts as well. Now, ask yourself the question, when you start doing learning facilitations, when you start doing training programs, when you start developing people, which of these are we using? And very, 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 very importantly, how many times do we have a process to internalize this and get people to think about it? You heard a story. Yes, it's there in the memory. But when do you sit down and think about it? What can I learn from this? What did I learn from it? What were the assumptions I made? I had a practical experience today. What can I learn from it? What should I learn from it? I was looking at my boss have a meeting today. What can I learn from it? What should I learn from it? If I am doing it, what can I do better? Now, this internalization, that introspection, that thinking never becomes part of training programs, never becomes part of learning exercises, never becomes part of an organizational culture. Because if you really ask yourself, when was the last time on your calendar you have a time to exercise? Most people do. You know, in the morning, I will wake up, I want to go for a jog because it's important for me to be physically fit. Fantastic. When was the last time you saw a calendar item that says thinking time? And chances are, if that doesn't happen, what you learn is out of chance, not by design. So whenever you're designing training programs, whenever you're designing learning interventions, whenever you're developing processes in order for an organization to build a culture of learning, you need to make sure that you internalize the introspection aspect. And this is very, very important, especially when you have large organizations. You must be able to get people to discuss what they learned and have peer learning as well. So if you want to build leaders, then I think you need to make sure that you incorporate all of these learning elements into the organization, into the program design. And you must be able to bring all of this out from people in order to make sure that they have internalized it. There's absolutely no point knowing something cognitively from an intellectual perspective if you cannot put it into practice. There's a lot we know cognitively, but do we really have the skill to put it into play? So the purpose of the entire approach that we recommend you have whenever you come up with any form of training is to incorporate as many of these features as possible. And very, very importantly, build in a process, build in a technique to ensure that you can actually get introspection. And let me give you one simple tool for this, right? At the end of if you're teaching anything, just absolutely anything, teach a tool. Once you teach the tool, put it into practice. And once it's put into practice, just give people 10 minutes to think about whether it worked, whether it didn't work, in what context did it work, in what context didn't it work, and what can you learn from it. If you just give that 5 to 10 minutes, people can process this inside their own heads. The issue is that most of the time, we don't actually build it into the program design. So there's absolutely no point doing any form of leadership training unless there's a structure. So you need to ask these simple questions. Is the training actually linked to what is required inside the organization? Most organizations have a competency matrix or a competency framework. If that isn't there, it's perfectly fine. But if it is there, you need to align it to that. If not, ask the simple question. Why do you want to do this training program? What do you want out of it? And whatever that you do inside the program should be aligned to it. If not, what's the point? Is training practically oriented? Or are we looking at theories? It's fantastic to talk about concepts. It's fantastic to talk about theories. It's great from a learning perspective to know all of this, absolutely. But at the workplace, what matters is that the individual can actually go and do it. So what are you doing? What are you building into the program that actually has practical implementation inbuilt in the program itself? Then, of course, you need to ask what happens after training. And is there a measurement? And the measurement cannot be a feedback form. Notice the fact that a feedback form assesses the trainer, not the participant. Now, the trainer needs to be assessed, of course. Was the training program good, bad, ugly? It's fine. You need to assess that. Of course you do. But shouldn't we actually measure the improvement of the person who has been trained also? So most of the time we have a feedback form and that's all there is. What happens afterwards? Why aren't we measuring their behavior? Why aren't we measuring their output after training? Why aren't we measuring their KPI improvement after training? Why aren't we giving them projects to do in order for us to find out for ourselves whether they've actually learned something or not and give them the space to try it out? So all of this is fine. And also at some point, if I am showing improvement, if I am portraying leadership, if I have made an remarkable growth in my normal journey inside the organization, then I must have some career advancement in that too. Don't ever forget that. So you train all of these people, ultimately they expect something in return. Not just a pat on the back to turn around and say, hey, you know what, you improved. Even in school, if you do well, you get a small prize, right? And that's given recognition and it's important. You imagine going through your entire school career without a prize giving, without ever knowing what a prize giving is. Chances are most of us wouldn't be motivated to necessarily go out there and get the best marks we possibly can. So that element must also be built in. So ultimately, all of these things need to be put together in order to make sure that any training that you do, any leadership training you do, any soft skills development programs you do, actually is able to deliver a result. If any of these elements are missing, chances are you wouldn't necessarily get that result. So up to now, my attempt has been to make sure that you understand that we are all in this trade called leadership training. We are all interested in it. We want to be in it. Some of us are already in it. You're looking at your organizations benefiting from leadership training and so on and so forth. And Jude's request to us was to give you some insight as to how it should be done in order to make sure that it makes impact. So conceptually, here's what we think should be done. But the big question that you're going to ask, and I know this because I get asked this question all the time. So before we break for questions, and give you answers for it. Let me answer one major question. Okay, we believe you. Great. Sounds plausible. Sounds logical. Does it really work? If you do all of this, does it really work? Honestly, can you quantify it? Well, the answer is yes. So for the last 15 years, we've been doing leadership training in various different organizations. Let me give you one example from a Sri Lankan organization. So in 2005, we joined hands with an organization called MAS Active. Just to give you a background, the MAS group is a $3 billion business out of Sri Lanka that manufactures apparel for most of the preferred vendors like Nike, like Marks and Spencer, top tier retail brands. Now, when they started out, when one of the divisions started out, they amalgamated a lot of organizations and made one cluster, and they wanted to bring a uniformed culture into play. And one of the biggest elements of that culture was leadership across the organization. And they gave us a brief with two simple requirements. Number one, we want leaders who live values. Number two, we want leaders who deliver results. Whatever you do is irrelevant at that point, but whatever you do, these two objectives must be met. We must have leaders who live by values. We must have leaders who deliver results. So we went about doing this for the last 14 years. The program has got refined 5 times over. And over 50 batches of people have been trained. MAS overall has over 100,000 people working within their fold. And each batch of 50 plus batches has about 35 to 50 participants from across the organization, ranging from production or manufacturing to quality to industrial engineering to merchandising to HR to all the departments inside the organization, young executives who are aspiring to become senior leaders and mid-level managers who are aspiring to become general managers and directors. Now, this is probably the longest running program in Sri Lanka. 14 straight years. Even during the financial crisis, the program ran. Even during COVID, programs ran, right? So there are over 1,500 participants that has gone through the program. 85% of them got promoted within the first 3 years. And most of the people who went through the first few batches are currently directors. And here's the kicker. After every single program, and this is not our numbers, these are numbers that has been verified and validated by their finance department. We have been able to show 2 times the investment that has been made. Typically, one of these programs are about $1 million rupees. That's about $5,000 to $10,000 if you want to convert it into dollars, depending on the conversion rates. But if you take a look at the return, we have always been able to give them at least 2 times tangible ROI after the training. Now, here's the beautiful part. The finance department never asks the question about the budgets for training, because they know that whatever money gets invested into these training programs actually gives tangible ROI. So most of the organizations within the MAS group currently runs this program, and it's a beautiful example of how you can do this in a way where you never get questioned as to why you need to do a program, because the answer is pretty simple. You build people up, you get business results. If the 2 of those are there, what more would you want? So training is not the problem. The way training is done, that is where you need to focus on. So if we move away from the typical training program mentality and take away that entire thinking pattern and move into the space which Jennifer and I love to talk about, which is called learning facilitation. If you facilitate learning through a process, and this process can't be short term, it has to be long term, it has to have a process, and a process cannot work in a 1.5 hour session or a day session. It doesn't work like that. It is long term. But if we build in those processes inside organizations, we change the entire landscape and the philosophy of how people view learning, how people view leadership development, how people view enhancement of soft skills inside a corporate setting, inside an organizational setting. And for once, we take away the stigma that is associated with it, which is that it doesn't work. We put all of this money, it doesn't work, simply gets taken away. So training is not the problem. It is the way it is done. And we need to move away from a training mindset to a learning facilitation mindset. And if we do that, then I think we are all better for it. So with that, I'm going to stop doing slides. I think the better part of this, and Jude was very, very clear about this, and told me, look, please, keep a lot of time for a question and answers, because that's where the real value addition comes from. I'm honoring your commitment. So this is your time to fire away questions. If you ask me very specific questions, I can give you very, very specific answers. Fire away, don't feel shy. We take no offense whatsoever in the questions you pose. So here's your time for questions. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Vidusha, for that thoughtful insight, the nuggets of wisdom. And as said, let's open the floor up. So you do have 3 options in terms of asking your questions. For those of you who are bold and want to try, do put up your raise hands icon, and I will happily invite you to ask any question on the subject that was covered today, or anything along the lines of leadership or management. And go on, take your chance and put Vidusha on the spot. I, of course, enjoy the opportunity to throw Vidusha under the bus every now and then. So this is my chance to have fun. So ask any question along the lines. For those who are a bit shy, feel free to type in text using the chat option on Zoom, or you've got a WhatsApp number that I've just shared. Drop me a WhatsApp and I will happily read out the question and leave your name out. So who wants to take the first shot on this? And I think for the most interesting question asked, Jude is going to volunteer and reward somebody with something at some point for all those in Nigeria. For the rest of the world, I can't say much. But for Nigeria, since I'm not in Nigeria, I can literally put Jude on the spot. Right. I did see a hand up.
Yes, go ahead.
No? No takers? Oh, brilliant. Valentine, go ahead, sir.
Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me?
Oh, yeah, loud
Absolutely.
and clear.
Thank you so much. My name is Valentine Camano Rivera. I'm originally from Mexico, but I currently reside in the States. And Your Excellency, I just want to say a very excellent presentation. It was one of the best so far that I've seen and been into and listened very well. I have a lot of notes. And my question very much is to follow up when it comes to presentation, just as you mentioned yourself, it's not just about the way I see a marketing perspective, but how can they themselves see in a leadership role in their community, not with just based on statistics? How can they feel they're making efforts, not just, again, not based on numbers, but have actual results and keep on with the continuation of leadership training in that role?
Can I quickly kind of ask a side question on that? Give me a little bit of context to that. I'll be able to answer it in very specific terms. In which contexts are you speaking of? Is it more to do with community leadership, or is it more corporate leadership?
Community leadership.
Great. Okay. So community leadership actually has a couple of fundamental ways of measurement. The first is what we call community impact. If you take a look at measurements of well-being, measurements of elevation of certain elements, those are impact areas that you can measure tangibly. You also have perception changes that takes place. So let's take the issue of of disease and disease prevention. And in disease prevention, you actually have people's perceptions playing a key role in how the disease spreads and also on how you mitigate a disease. So if people's perceptions change, for example, COVID is a good example of this. I'm bringing Sri Lanka as an example because, you know, I can give you examples from it very freely, and also because, you know, I'm not sure whether this is common across the globe, but in Sri Lanka, it's not often that we would wash our hands all the time. Now, in certain cultures, you wash your hands all the time. Our kids would go and play in the garden, would come, and of course, we eat with our hands, so you would wash your hands. But it's not one of those things that you do as a practice mandatorily and where everyone enforces it to such an extent that it gets taken seriously. It's supposed to be done, but we take it for granted. Brushing teeth. In the morning, brushing your teeth, absolutely, yes, it gets done. In the night, whether people brush their teeth, well, is up for debate. So these are perceptions about things. So at community level, when you do programs on leadership, we actually look at both these paradigms. The first is actual impact that gets made through projects, and also change of perceptions depending on the type of projects you do. Now, how do you make sure that you link that to actual training that has been done? The way you do that is by linking curriculums and the kind of tools that is being used to disseminate the leadership aspects in the program, and measuring how the perceptions or the impacts are impacted by that. I'm more than happy to get into the technical aspects of this, but I think you got the point, right? But and once again, if you want more details on this, please feel free to reach out to us, and I'll happily go on for an hour on it. But there are three aspects to this, and let me break that down also for you very quickly. The first is to look at making sure that you identify the impact in a quantifiable manner, number one. In relation to that, you must be able to peg the learning outcomes. In relation to the learning outcomes, you must be able to work backwards to the toolkits that you need to dispense. If these three steps are followed, your program will be effective, and you'll be able to measure it, and you'll be able to directly and proportionately understand how much of an impact it has had. I hope I answered your question.
Perfect. I do appreciate the insight of the whole aspect. And yes, I would like to follow up with that 1 hour question. That would be very interesting. Thank you very much for your answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Valentine, for that. Appreciate that. Thank you, Vidusha. Jennifer, I can see your hand up, and I'm guessing you've got a question. I'm not sure whether this is the point I should run away or stay back and enjoy the fun, but go right ahead, ma'am. The floor is yours. You're on mute, I think.
Thank you for that detailed information. It's always fascinating to see someone, how they can drill deep into pulling out the different nuances that we actually overlook. I have one question though, and that is about, even if we are approaching organizations and talking to them about the importance of leadership, the leaders themselves within the organizations may not even think that that is something that is important for either themselves, because they think they have the answers to everything. But when they look at the ROI at the end of the year, they actually see that business is not doing well. I've always actually made it a point to say that if the people within the organization are not motivated or challenged or excited about what they're doing, obviously it's going to impact that. So my question to you is, what would be the best way of approaching organizations in helping them to see the value addition of what facilitation, as opposed to training and telling people what to do, but extrapolating from the people, the brilliance that they already are, and helping them to, make it so amazingly interesting, exciting, invigorating for them to think that they own the organization.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Though I must admit, now I'm on the spot and I'm being recorded. So I must be careful about what I say. I have two answers for this. I'll go through both. One is the politically correct one. Let me get that out of the way first. Uh, the politically correct answer to this question is, I know Jennifer well, so I'm sorry if I, kind of seems over familiar, but that's what it is. But genuinely, if you were to kind of look at it from a pitch perspective, and if you're going into an organization and saying, you know what, training doesn't necessarily work, we need to look at a facilitation, we need to look at a long-term process. I generally pitch at three pivotal points. The first is to ask the question whether whatever they have done thus far has worked. Secondly, if it hasn't worked, why hasn't it worked? And thirdly, and this is where it gets a little uncomfortable for the organization concerned, is to ask the question, would you be open to something new? And 9 times out of 10, in our part of the world, we are really polite, so you wouldn't say no to somebody's face. but you could see from the facial reactions whether you are a go or a no go. However, having that conversation, I've often found, provides insight, and it helps, because at some point somebody's asking the question all the time inside their own mind, you know what, it isn't really working. Why isn't it working? Should we try something else? Now, if it is working 9 times out of 10, even if it is working, they do ask the question, can it be done better? So I think it's a good conversation to have, and that's the politically correct way to go about this. The honest answer to this is this. I think it's a bit, and let me take it away from the organizational setting and just bring it down to a person setting, right? I think in all of our lives, we go through motions and we go through stages. And if we are lucky, we come into that stage where we ask ourselves the question, is this all there is to life? Now, I don't think we get there by being in abject poverty, because forever then you're trying to make sure that ends meet. And you can't espouse philosophical theory and intellectual conversation and witty repartees when you're hungry. It just doesn't work that way. Realization only comes when your belly is full. So I think it's important to understand the same is true for organizations as well. When they start organizations out, if you're an entrepreneur, the last thing on your mind is developing people and leadership training and all the rest of it is just by the way. You need to focus on the business and you need to grow it. But at some point, you do realize, especially when you start scaling an organization, you know what, our people are inadequate. They're just not equipped with the skills to take this beyond this. And this happens generally in the first 10 years. And then, of course, comes the interest in doing some form of development exercise, but generally it's half-baked, and most of the time it's because somebody feels good about doing it. And it's a good start. Nothing wrong with it. You have to start somewhere. At some point, you have to start somewhere. It's better than not starting at all. It's a bit like me being overweight. I was 125 kilos. And I wanted to have a six-pack. It ain't gonna happen because I wished it. Right? And at 125 kilos, I couldn't run. I wanted to go for a jog, but it was more like a crawl. And then, of course, my colleagues and friends would laugh at me saying, really, Vidusha, you call this exercise? Well, it's exercise for me. This is all I can do right now. I think the same is true for organizations. You got to start somewhere. It's fine. Just do the half day. Just do that typical training program. It's perfectly fine. You start there. However, at some point, you do come into the realization that just doesn't cut it. And at some point, people do wake up to the reality that you have to waken the potential of a person from within. And that is when yours and my philosophy comes into play. And I think at that point, organizations are ready to not only try new things, but to deviate completely and look at completely radical solutions. And I think having that conversation will elicit that.
Thank you very much for your input. As always, brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that. Vidusha, I've got a WhatsApp message from someone, clearly doesn't want to come in on screen or be public. How does an organization identify if the trainer or the training organization is the right fit for their company or for the organization, I guess?
Okay, good question. I generally have a very, very simple starting point to this, and it's a very valid question. How do you decide whether this is the right training partner or this is the right fit for the organization? Before I answer that question, let me just make one statement, which is I have yet to meet a bad trainer as much as I have yet to meet a bad employee. I need to state that because we look at this from a right and wrong perspective. I honestly think there isn't a right and wrong perspective. However, there is such a thing called the right fit for you. And let me give you an example of this and then move into the technical aspect of the question. It's a bit like marriage. Now, how do you find the right partner? You know, if I ask that question of somebody, the answer is, well, I don't know, right? Because how do you find the perfect partner? There's no such thing. It's a work in progress. Been married a few years, nearly 2 decades and counting, and it's still work in progress. If you ask my wife, can you find things that she could improve in? She'll give you a laundry list of things that I can improve in. But would it mean that she would ditch me for someone else? I'm sincerely hoping not. You know, so there is such a thing called there is no perfect person and there is no perfect training partner. But there is something called the right fit, and the right fit, unlike in marriage, may change over time. So here is the specific set of answers for you. Having said that, number one, ask yourself the question of what you want out of the training. That you must be very clear about. You cannot be wishy-washy about this. If you call in for a trainer to come in and make a pitch, be very specific about what the outcome should be. And 9 times out of 10, organizations give very, very vague answers to this question. I want them to improve communication skills. Well, what do you mean by that? I want them to improve leadership. Well, what do you mean by that? Get specific, get down to the nuts and bolts of it. Number one. Number two, ask yourself whether you want skills to be improved or knowledge to be imparted. Knowledge to be imparted is very, very different to skills being able to be, looked upon as enhancement of skill. Knowledge component merely requires an individual to know his subject matter. Skill enhancement, on the other hand, if you want someone to do that for you, that person must have practical expertise as well. Let me give you an example of that as well. If you want your son to learn how to swim, since I brought the swimming example earlier, you want the fellow to just be able to not kill himself if he jumps into a river. Well, anyone with basic skill will be able to kind of teach the person, basic knowledge will be able to teach your son to be able to swim or your daughter to swim. However, if your objective is for your son or daughter to swim at the Olympics, you better find someone who has been there and done that at that level. So you need to make sure that you clarify between the two. Do you want knowledge imparted? You want skill enhanced? The final part is whether you want industry-specific aspects or not. Now, this is a tricky one because for many things, industry specifics doesn't come into play. For example, people management. If you take a look at interactions between people, whatever industry you're in, the broad outlines are exactly the same. It's general. However, how are you supposed to make sure that remote teams work together in specific projects in the IT sector is fundamentally different to how people are managed inside the manufacturing setting. The nuances of it are very different. So if you ask these 3 questions and then take a look at the trainer, where have they worked? 3 questions to ask there also. Where have you worked? I'm not talking of where have you trained. I'm asking where have you worked? Okay. Number 2, what are the deliverables you have been able to show after training? And number 3, only once you have gone through these 2 questions, number 3 should be, what are the types of training programs you have done and what is your experience as a trainer? If those 2 first aspects are not covered, then chances are you cannot hire that trainer for skill enhancement purposes. For knowledge sharing, any trainer would do. But for skill enhancement, you need to be a lot more specific than that. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you for that. And I'm hoping that whoever asked that gets or got that answer and benefits from that. And Vidush, interesting point that you brought in, but I would also like to bring in a point that Dr. Adamullah brought about while you were presenting that, which is something very nice. And thank you for that, Doctor. And he says, I have an observation or an advice that leaders should lead by example in order to influence our subordinates to carry out their assignments the way they are supposed to do it. And then I couldn't agree more with that. But Vidush, any thoughts on that?
Could I, with permission, do a small addition to that? I think it's a very, very valid pointer. I think something that happened just today in the morning is fresh in my mind. And I think I need to bring in that because I think it's a caveat to what you've mentioned. I couldn't agree with you more. And I absolutely agree. I think one of the biggest and most fundamental issues of leadership is that we don't practice what we preach. And when that happens, it's very, very difficult. Having said that, I must admit, there was something that happened in the morning today. I told you my son inherits my genetic makeup, so he happily questions people all the time. And he made an observation that was very, very thought-provoking, to say the least. So we asked him to study, and he got into trouble today because he didn't study. And he asked the question of his mother and me, why don't you study? I kind of sat back and thought, how am I supposed to answer this question, And it's true, we don't study. He doesn't see us studying at all. He sees us browsing the net and, doing research and things like that, but he doesn't consider that studying. He considers us playing, not studying. Studying is with books and note papers and things like that. Why don't you study, Ma? Why don't you study, Dad? So couldn't answer this in front of the wife, so I took him aside and turned around and quietly told him in my usual lackadaisical pointed way. I told him, you know what, the reason I don't study now is because I studied before. And I did study during my time. I did take in the time, but your point is valid. You don't see us studying. What would you have us do? Because I don't have a program that I can go to. And he turns around and says, you know what, it'll be nice if you are also studying, when I'm studying. And I can't fault him for that, but I can't do it either. My timelines don't match with his. When he's studying, I'm off working. And when I come home, I really don't want to be studying some textbook because I have other things to do as preparation for the program. So herein lies your problem. Sometimes, even though you have done this in previous aspects of your job, your juniors who are looking at you now might not necessarily see you doing it at this moment in time. And this is what sometimes gives rise to this issue. So we are wise to understand this and be able to have a conversation around it. And I told my wife that maybe what we should do is quietly, maybe pick up a book of interest and at least for an hour, read. We read anyway. It's just that we don't read typical books like he does. We read most of our content on the computer today. But maybe it's a good idea to take a book and whenever he's doing his studies, ever so often at least, maybe we read during that time, just so that he knows he's not alone in that. So I think your point is absolutely valid. But from a manager's perspective, sometimes you might not necessarily be seen to do certain things. That doesn't mean you don't or didn't do it before, but your role might not require it right now. For example, coming to work on time. Let me give you a simple example for that. Coming to work on time. Now, everyone's expected to come to work on time, most of the time in most organizations. And let's say 8:30, you're supposed to come. So you come to work at 8:30, but you turn up as a manager at 10:30. But that's because you had a management meeting elsewhere and you walked into office soon after that. And this might happen quite a lot in your chosen vocation based on the job you do. Now, if people watch this and ask themselves, hey, you know what? Boss never comes on time, tells us to come on time. What is this? If you pick up on that vibe, you do need to ask yourself, am I honestly guilty as charged? And if I am, I need to correct myself. That much humility we must have as leaders. But if it's not true, if it's purely about visibility, I think it's important to pick up on that conversation and get people to understand that sometimes we can't necessarily do exactly what we tell others to do because our role is different. And I think that needs to be weighed in as well. I hope I gave some insight to that.
It's a great way of putting that in, Vidusha. Thank you very much for that. We are mindful of the time. No, it's a Saturday morning. We did promise 5, so we've got a last few minutes remaining. While we still have 3 to 4 minutes, if anyone's got in a last question, comment, thought, suggestion. Yes, Abbas, go right ahead, please.
Thank you so very much, first of all. And it's really an honor. Learned a lot. Thank you so much to my mentor, my friend Jude, because he gave me the opportunity to get benefited from Mr. Vidusha, Madam Jennifer, and Luminary Learn, because you've written it there, and you're a lovely person, the way you are organizing everything, sir. Thank you so very much. And in personally, I had this problem. I was facing the same problem at home and at office as well, that they say, you tell us what to do and you don't do it yourself. So it's a simple problem, but today I got the answer and got the confidence. The way I learned it from Mr. Vidusha, that obviously we have done that part uh, in earlier stage. So we don't need to do it again. Like when I tell my daughter to say something or to do something, she says that, please don't tell me, you don't do it yourself. So yeah, this is the answer. Now I know how to handle her, who is more important to me than my office. And again, my secondary part is my office, where my little team complains that you tell us what to do and you come late. So yeah, obviously at home, I'm also taking stress of my work more than my employees. So yeah, you're very right, because it's my investment, it's my partnership with one or two, three people, which I have to take care of and give the accounts. So yeah, it's a very beautiful answer that we have done that part in our times, and now we have to apply it, and we take the stress at home. When we are sleeping, we are dreaming of work, and being employees, you guys are just sleeping. So yeah, it's wonderful, and everything which is here, because no questions, everything was so clear, that in the beginning, when because I went to do something, I'm at home right now, but I was hearing all of you. My attention was not away from the meeting, because I was hearing, it was in my headphones. So I didn't miss anything, by God's grace, Alhamdulillah. We can learn as adults. We cannot get trained. That's so wonderful. Again, it's a simple thing, but trust me, sir, I didn't understand this before this webinar. We cannot get trained as adults. Again, by Mr. Vidusha, perfectly said, we must analyze this statement because it is deep. And are we willing to learn? So much is there. Are we willing to learn? Is the training actually linked with it? Practically oriented or not? Incentives are compulsory. Like we were at school, we were getting incentives or gifts or awards or fake trophies. So that gave us confidence. It's wonderful what you taught us. We should apply that in our offices, because if it's big organizations, they do that. I've been working in some big organization by God's grace, but now I'm running small businesses. So I should apply that more often, that give them gifts or incentives or encouragement, empowerment like that, by giving them awards, recognition. Okay, wow. And we want to lead, we want leaders who live by values. Great statement. We want leaders who live by values. And you build people up, you get the results. Amazing. I mean, amazing. Training mindset against learning facilitation mindset. This is again simple, but I'm sure so many people don't know. I'm not talking about this platform. I'm sure on this platform, all the students are A1. I'm talking about people like me who just learned this strategy now on the spot from Mr. Vidusha, that training mindset is important more than, training mindset should not be there. Learning facilitation mindsets should be there. And sir, you use so many long and strong English words. Again, I'm from Pakistan, and I respect that. Community leadership, it was asked by our friend from Mexico. Again, answers were great. I needed the answers as well. Community impact is important. Perception changes happen in that process, said by Mr. Vidusha. Identify the impact, measure it. Wow. Okay. Then answers to Jennifer Madam by Mr. Vidusha, to ask whether their strategy has worked or not. So everything is so wonderful. Would you be open to something new? Again, so much is there. So much is there. We must be positive. What we preach, the end part, amazing. Thank you so very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abbas. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Abbas. Okay.
One small question came up. If you don't mind, can I take just 2 minutes to answer that, because it just came in. Can you please give us the best time to use transactional or transformational leadership style
Correct.
at work?
Wow. Great.
Can I quickly answer that, Jude? Is that okay?
Yes, you can. You can.
Sure.
Sure.
Okay. I'm mindful of everyone's time. I deeply apologize. Just that when I see questions, I generally tend to answer it. So if you do want to ask questions afterwards, once we finish the session, please feel free to stay back. I'm more than happy to answer them. I'll give you a short answer because time is of the essence. Here's the thing. I generally, and I mean this very, very respectfully, I understand the difference between transactional and transformational leadership. Transactional is, when you do an interaction. Transformational is when you go through change inside the organization. I try and shy away from dissecting leadership like that. I see leadership as something that you need to own. So it's not a title. It's not a job. I consider it almost like a sacred duty. And I always bring this back to the most simplest and most fundamental things. So whether you are, but there's a technical answer to that. So let me answer that first technically. The technical answer to it is, if you have no growth, if you are in a static environment, and if your organizational processes are simple, transactional leadership will do. However, if you're going through change, if you're going through a lot of different processes and the processes are complex, and if you're looking at exponential growth, then transformational leadership is more required. Having said that, please understand, with whichever terminology you use, it's the same person who has to do this, right? So if I'm going through an organization that is static at this moment in time, and we're trying to go through growth, either you have to fire me and bring a transformational leader, or you got to get me to be a transformational leader myself. So let me just quickly bring this down to parenting, right? So notice the fact that when you're a parent for the first time, you have a very transactional approach with your children. I tell you what to do, they do what I tell them to do, and we are all happy. And then comes, of course, the young teenage ages when children will, not really listen to you, and you get very upset about it, and find that your authority is jeopardized and, feel frustrated about it and so on and so forth. This is the same thing when it comes to organizational change. When that happens, you do have to take on a transformational approach. Otherwise, you lose the relationship that you have with your children. So I often tell people when they become parents that we are not raising kids. We are raising adults in the making. We are not raising kids, right? We are raising adults in the making. So adults of the future. So if you look at the organization also that way, you're not managing an organization, you're not leading an organization. You're simply taking care of it for the next generation to come. If you look at it from that perspective, you will act appropriately to the situation, instinctively. The issue is that we've put these hats on in our heads and we think based on those hats that we wear. So don't think of it as transformational. Don't think of it as transactional. Simply tell yourself that I'm here for a temporary period of time. I'm here to look after the organization for the benefit of the next generation. And if you look at it from that perspective, I think whatever answers that you need to have, you'll have it inside you itself. So I hope I answered that question. Oh dear, there are other ones coming. So I will pass it on to Jude and then say, let's close the session. I will remain with you and I'll answer that question. What do you understand with situational leadership and how to judge that and all the rest of it? I will answer that, but I'm respectful of everyone else's time. So Jude, I'll pass it on to you and I'll answer that question. I'll wait back and answer that question for anyone who wants to ask questions afterwards.
Okay, thank you, Vadisha. Thank you, Anton. Thank you, everybody present. I think what we will do is maybe for those that still have questions, please, you can stay behind. Then for those that that feel like they want to leave the meeting, because we don't want to cut anybody's time, maybe have other things to do. We know that today is Saturday, maybe a lot of people have to do some cleanup in their house and all of that to prepare for Sunday. For those that are free, you still have more questions or something you still want to learn from the question that people will ask, you can stay back. Then for those that, maybe have something else to do, you are free to leave the meeting now. And I want to say again that this session is actually an introductory session, okay? We have a lot of training coming up. I mean, Luminary Learning is actually the best in this, and we are just bringing them into Nigeria. Okay, so for those present here, maybe in some state in Nigeria, you're based in Nigeria, if you feel like you need these services, maybe there's a training you want us to do in your state. It can be student, it can be your company, the company's employee, maybe your company CEOs, maybe student that need soft skill training development, please. I think we sent you our email before. We also gave you our WhatsApp contact. Please, you can reach me or you can reach Anton. We will discuss how we carry out those training, okay? Luminary is best at this. That work with World Bank, UNESCO, that have worked in almost 15 countries across the continent of the world. So we are bringing them to Nigeria. They have also worked in Ghana. So we are representing them in Nigeria. If there's any training you need at all, please feel free to reach us or contact us. So what you have seen today is just a bit of, let me say 1% out of 100% of what they have to offer to people in Nigeria as regards to training and consulting service. Okay, so I want to thank everybody once again. Please, if you still want to stay back, you can stay back to continue the session. Then if you feel like maybe you have something to do, please, you are free to leave because this session has ended. You can reach us. The recording is available. We sent you an email. You can respond to our email. I drop an email also to you. I also drop my WhatsApp contact. You can reach me. You can reach Anton. Anything you feel like you want to ask, you want to discuss, maybe after this session, feel free to reach us at your convenience time. Then we will respond to you and see how we can provide solutions to your needs and every other things. So I think you can continue with the answers to all the questions.
Right. So on that note, Jude, thank you very much. A quick thanks to Jude and the Leadership Assembly team in Nigeria for the partnership with us, for making this a possibility. Once again, thank you for your presence and participation. I'd say stay safe, stay productive.